Now to the appalling state of Australia's aged care system, a subject we should not allow to go under the radar, but I think many in the media are. This week, two of Australia's leading medical bodies have called on the federal government to make urgent changes to the nation's aged care system. Doctors want more funding and more staff to be introduced to aged care homes before the Royal Commission ends next year. There is no reason why you'd have to wait until the end of a Royal Commission and then the end of the recommendations from that Royal Commission before doing something about this sector. Now, the Australian Medical Association and Nurses Union say that they cannot watch the situation continue to deteriorate while waiting for the Royal Commission into the issue to hand down its findings. And joining me now from Melbourne is Butler, Federal Secretary for the Australian Nursing and Midwifery Federation. Anne, thank you very much for your time.
That's my pleasure, Chris.
Have you been shocked by some of the evidence that has emerged from this Royal Commission? From someone like yourself in the aged care sector, I would have thought you'd be fairly insensitive to it because of what you've seen with your own eyes.
Yeah, Chris, insensitive's not the word I would use, but shocked is not the word I would use either. Unfortunately, we've been campaigning in this space for some years, and so unfortunately the stories that are emerging now through the Royal Commission are not news to me. And as you raised earlier, one of the more deeply concerning areas that we find is that what's happening is those stories aren't diminishing, they aren't going away, in fact they appear to be getting worse. And yeah, it's difficult to watch and to see the pain. But what I think is needed to happen is that we need to see the truth emerge. As you say, get the attention of the media, and let's start doing something proper about it.
Yeah, I don't know whether it's because of economic considerations at the moment or whether it's the drought, but this is not getting the attention it deserves. But the problems with the aged care sector are multi-layered. This is not a simple fix, is it?
It's not a simple fix. It's a complex sector that requires complex consideration. But what the doctors' groups, the AMA, and what we're saying together is that there are things we can start doing now. We don't have to wait for the Royal Commission to go through all the layers that are required to start taking action that will stop some of the suffering that we're seeing. We actually joined forces with the AMA and with a couple of other doctors' groups back in December last year. We wrote to the Prime Minister then, making a few calls for action starting to happen. We completely support the Royal Commission. It's doing very good work, but what prompted us to take a stand again yesterday was that the Royal Commission's been extended for 6 months. Now, that's due to some of the complexity, and to get the system fully fit and prepared for the future when we will be facing increasing demand, we know that the Commission needs to take that work. But we shouldn't have to sit for another 2 years and watch elderly suffer in pain, neglected and occasionally dying before they should.
Yeah, and that will be the case in that 6-month period. And we've got precedents for this. We've had the Financial Institutions Royal Commission, and there were a set of guidelines and moves by the government on the financial sector way before we had the second lot of recommendations. So I think what you're saying makes a lot of sense. What about carer to patient ratios? This will blow people's minds, but remind our viewers exactly what the national ratio is.
OK, so if we look at an average, so we've got registered nurses in the sector, but clearly not enough, because we would say that the average ratio of registered nurse to residents across the country, obviously this is not everywhere, but if we average it out, it would be 1 registered nurse to 100 residents.
How pathetic is that? 1 to 100. You turn up to a childcare centre and they have 1 to 20. If depending on what state and territory you're in, but 1 to 20 I think it is in New South Wales, and we've got 1 to 100 for the frail and elderly. That is pathetic.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more, Chris. I just couldn't agree with you more. And you can see that when you're faced with that ratio, you might have the best qualified nurse, they might have the best intentions, they might have the best attitude towards the elderly, but if you're on a night shift and you're a registered nurse and somebody has a fall and one other resident has an incident going on, how could you possibly be taking care of the other 98? It's just not possible. So we are just going to see the condition the conditions and the situation continue to deteriorate. And we know that even in the last year, 2, 3 years, it's continued to deteriorate. And it's hitting a point where the staff stay there because they're so committed to the elderly and they're so committed to the work that they do, but they just can't. They can't continue and they can't bear it. So we can start action now.
We should be starting action now. What about, just back on ratios for a second, what do you think would be a suitable passable ratio, and therefore how much would it cost government to introduce?
Yeah, okay. So we've done a major piece of research looking at what we call the care needs are of elderly people out across nursing homes, and we know that they need I'll put it in an hours form for you, they need an average 4.3 hours of care a day. They currently get 2.8, so you can see what the gap is. We know that that's going to take time to implement, but we think it will take about 5 years, and we'd like to see a situation where you have a ratio which we have in state-run nursing homes in Victoria, which is not very many, but we have this ratio here of, on a day shift, 1 registered nurse to 15 or 20 residents. So it's going to cost money to invest in that staffing, but you're going to reap a return by, we estimate that you can save about $500 million by stopping turnover, by stopping agency nurse use, by stopping attrition, all of those sorts of things.
Yeah.
We also think that you can save about $2 billion by preventing people going to hospital when they shouldn't need to. If we had proper staffing in nursing homes across the country, we'd be able to reduce hospital admissions and keep people well, save about $2 billion. But we know it's going to take some investment. We need the investment to get the return. And we think that the Prime Minister, when he called this Royal Commission, he would have understood that there were going to be resources involved. He would have understood, he would have known that he would have had to commit to some of the recommendations of the Royal Commission, and we're saying that that can start now. We also think that elderly Australians, they're our mums and dads, they're our granddads, our nanas. They've invested in us. They've built this country for us. Aren't they worth us investing in them now?
Too right. That's exactly why we need to commit, and we need to commit a whole lot more than what we're already doing. Can I ask you this? I've got friends who are carers in aged care facilities, and when they hear that their aged care facility and the umbrella organisation that owns the aged care facility receives a major federal government grant, they don't see any change to the way their aged care facility operates or additional resources. Is it true that we have a sector that allows, for some reason, and probably for greedy reasons, allows federal government grants to just go straight through to the keeper and end up in under their profit line?
Absolutely. This is a critical concern for us, and it's another thing that we've been calling for a while, and now the doctors are joining us in this call. We need much better transparency in funding. This is taxpayer funding. The sector is 70% taxpayer funding, and we know that there have been injections of money here, there, supplements. Nurses and carers always tell us they don't see the difference on the
some of the
floor.
money obviously just disappears into someone's pocket.
It disappears. So we need to introduce a mechanism where we can see where the money goes, that it's going directly to care. Taxpayers have a right to be absolutely confident that the money they're happy to put forward is going to care for our elderly.
One final problem that I have seen and has surfaced in conversations that I've had with people in the sector is the fact that what we find is that when owners of facilities contract the management out to someone else, it's a recipe for disaster. Am I right?
Indeed. And I think we've seen that recently in the Earlhaven case in Queensland. That's exactly what's happened. It seems to be a bit of a pattern, and there's a big variation of providers across the industry, but it can be a pattern. It's exactly what they do. They contract it out, then they have a hands-off approach, and there's not proper oversight. There's certainly a very big lack of clinical oversight and clinical governance that's happening in the actual facilities, and it needs to be massively improved.
Yeah, exactly. One final question. Have you had any response or feedback from government since you joined with the AMA late yesterday?
No, we haven't. So we're waiting for some responses.
You've had nothing?
No.
So have you...
I've in fact contacted the New Aged Care Minister. I've requested a meeting with him. I've invited him to come and attend meetings to talk to our members and our delegates.
And nothing?
But we've had no response, no. We've been put on the list, apparently.
On the list of people they need to see?
Who are contacting him, requesting a meeting.
Well, I would have thought between the AMA and the Nurses and Midwifery Association, you two should be at the top of the list. However, I hope the federal government gets off its big backside and does something about this. And I'm really disappointed, as I say, in other sections of the media that don't bring this to the forefront, because something needs to be done about our elderly, because they are dying, they are being badly cared for in many of these facilities, as we've seen through the Royal Commission.